Hello, and thank you for joining this TenantCloud webinar. I appreciate you taking the time to join this presentation for today. We're going to get started here right away. Hopefully, don't want to take too much of your time. I know it's still the 9th of the month, so some people are still dealing with rent collections and things of that nature. If you can hear me, if you could go ahead and hit one of those emoji icons at the bottom of the screen, just so I know that you can hear what I'm saying. Awesome. Fantastic. I just want to make sure I wasn't having any technical difficulties here. I do want to, with full transparency, just say that this particular webinar, you may feel like some of the information is elementary or property management 101. However, if you're like me, it's always a good thing to revisit some of the basics and get a little bit more of the intermediate information as well. I am going to jump into sharing my screen here real quick. There may be some things that you'll learn throughout this webinar that maybe you haven't thought of before, or maybe you've just forgotten about. And so hopefully the information that we share is going to be beneficial to you in one form or another. I just do want to make that clarification up front. As you all know, property management in itself is not necessarily rocket science. It's more a business of systems and policies and practices and consistency in practicing those things and making sure that you're being proactive about being mitigating risk and making sure that you're covered on as many angles as possible. And a big part of that is the forms that you use that people sign and the terms and agreements that they put their signature on. So we're going to jump right in here real quick. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if it's going to let me. Sometimes these Mac computers like to give issues. Bear with me one second here with permissions. All right. Sorry about that. I am back here. Hopefully this time it lets me share my screen. Bear with me one second. Every so often my Mac computer gives me permission issues that I have to reset in order to be able to share the screen with y'all. So I reset those permissions and we'll give this another shot. All right, looks like it's going to work this time. All right, and you should be able to see my screen now. So the first thing I'm going to jump in real quick, and we're not going to spend a lot of time in the software. I'm going to jump into the actual presentation here, but I do want to show this to you right away. From the main screen here, if you were on the growth plan or higher, and you go to the settings gear wheel icon button in the upper right corner of your account and click on document templates, this is where this particular presentation is focused on, because you can actually get landlord forms inside of TenantCloud that are pre-done for you. They're pre-done templates that you can use in all 50 states. And these are the general documents that are applicable in all 50 states across the United States. So you can't change the verbiage in pretty much any of these agreements because they have been written specifically to meet all of the requirements in each state for this type of document. Now, this landlord forms tab is not going to have every single type of document you need because there's a wide variety of documents that you need in each individual state, in each individual city and county. And so this particular tab just covers the core documents that you can use in all 50 states. And so if you're looking for these types of documents, all you have to do is to click into the document here, and you'll see that it's default to display all states. Again, you cannot edit the text text in these documents, it is going to automatically fill in this information from the lease that you are dealing with. So when you go to move a tenant in, it's going to automatically fill in these autofill tags, and you'll be able to designate where they need to sign if you want to change any of this stuff up. But the document already has that preset as well. So most people just go with that standard format. But if you want to add individual initials on each line item or each paragraph, you can do that when you go to move a tenant in. You can also do that by when you're on the final step of the move-in process, there will be a menu on the far right side of the document that says, do you want to add initials or additional signatures? So you can use these addendums on your leases. And again, these are applicable for all 50 states. And so if you don't have any of these, you might want to go through some of these. These are standard documents that most property managers and landlords use across the US. And we're going to cover some of these as well in the presentation that we're going to jump into right now. If you need help with any of this, you can pull up document templates. And you can pull up instructional articles that are going to walk you step by step through how to do things like I was just saying about adding additional initials into document templates. How do you add notice templates? Pretty much anything as it relates to the template tool. So if you get stuck on any of those, of course, you can reach out to our support team via the chat with us button. If one of our chat team members is available at that moment, you can put in a support ticket, and you can also call our support team at this number listed here. Otherwise, these are going to give you step-by-step instructions along with arrows showing you exactly where to click and what to do and how to do each of those things. So that being said, we're going to jump right into the presentation here and cover the rental documents that every landlord should have. Now, that's somewhat of a general statement because these are the core documents that every landlord should have. There are additional documents that you may use in your city or state that may be completely foreign to somebody else in another city or state because maybe you have a separate city ordinance, or maybe your state has passed different laws from the state next door. And so these are going to really be a lot of the core documents, but we are going to go over a pretty big list of about 30 or 40 documents here that you may or may not currently use and may find beneficial. So these are some of the sections we're going to go over. Rental documents every landlord should have: the primary lease agreement, common lease addendum, and then other common lease addendums to consider. So typically, a landlord is going to have the primary lease document, and that could be, depending on where you are, could be a small one, could be 8 pages long. It could be as much as 27 or maybe even 30 plus pages. The one that I have used here in Texas over the years is about 27 pages long. That is the core lease document. And then on top of that, there are additional addendums. And so one single lease for us might have been about 35 pages long. And almost every single page in that lease gets some type of initial or date and signature. The primary lease document is typically considered something like a foundation for the rest of the lease agreement, including any associated addendums. What typically happens with the lease addendums is oftentimes, at least in Texas, they have verbiage on the addendums that says something about if anything in this addendum conflicts with the primary lease document, this addendum overrides the paragraph in the primary lease document. And so it's important to understand your lease and where those conflicts may arise and which document overrides the other one if you have that in your state. And so if you're not reading your lease documents and you're not familiarizing yourself with them, that's the first thing that I would recommend as a part of making sure you're covering all your bases. The more that you understand the lease document, the better you can explain it to your tenants. And that's actually one of the tips that I wanted to cover real quick here is when you are moving tenants in, I guarantee that your tenants, and this is just from years of experience in property management, tenants are not reading what they are signing. A lot of people, it's a lot of fine print, especially if it's 20, 30 plus pages long. People are not reading all of the individual paragraphs. And so it's important that you have a way to highlight a lot of the most important things in your document that you want to make sure that the tenants know and understand. It could be things that you've discovered over the years where maybe it's something that comes up consistently. Maybe it's a disagreement that comes up consistently or a misunderstanding that comes up consistently between you and your tenants. Make a list of those things and then make sure that those are highlighted during the move-in process, during the lease signing process, so that it's covered in advance and so that it reduces the amount of misunderstandings and conflict down the road. And the tenant understands, okay, I'm agreeing to this specific thing. And so when we would move people into rental properties, one of the things that we would do is we would go over the highlights throughout the lease that were the most important things that caused the most conflict down the road. Maybe you have a utility fee, turn on fee, where you turn on utilities on behalf of the tenant and you charge a fee to do that because maybe you have to pay the city utility a fee to turn on the water, or maybe you have to do something else with the city and it costs $25. And so you charge the $25, or maybe you charge 30 or 35, whatever it may be. Or maybe it is pet weight limits. And maybe it is people who don't have a pet when they move in, but you want to make sure that they understand the process of when you move in, if you do get a pet, you have to go through this process. And that process is A, B, and C. And that was a common thing that I would encounter, especially in Texas, is particularly in Austin and Houston, because there are a ton of pet owners in those cities, or people adopt pets a lot of times. And so people would always have a misunderstanding of what process they had to go through in order to make sure that that pet was documented and paid for, and any deposits and so forth at the property, especially if they hadn't moved into the property initially with that pet to begin with. And so that's just a couple of examples, but there are a dozen or more scenarios where you want to make sure that the tenant understands the process. And it's going to be a little different in each market. What may be common in the markets that I work in won't be the same as the markets that you work in. And so just paying attention to those things and making sure that you cover those and highlight those important things that are recurring issues on a regular basis. So moving on, in this webinar, we're going to cover the primary lease agreement as well as a host of lease addendums that many landlords and property managers use across the country, some of which you have may never heard of, but could apply to your rental management business. So the initial lease agreement, as we've discussed, is a contract between the landlord and the tenant. It typically states basic things like the terms of the tenancy, such as the length of the tenancy, the amount of rent, and who is responsible for paying utilities, late fees, grace periods, and all that good stuff. That's usually information that is contained in the primary lease document. And then there's secondary lease documents, for example, a lease addendum, which may be used for things such as utilities if there's additional circumstances or conditions that need to be addressed regarding that particular paragraph in the primary lease. For example, at one property that I managed in Houston, we had to have a separate utility agreement because all of the buildings, well, not all, most of the buildings operated off of a single boiler system. And that controlled whether or not you could run heat or AC in your entire building. And then the buildings on the outside around the perimeter of the core buildings, they actually had their own separate HVAC systems that they could control in their unit whenever they wanted. They could turn on heat or AC without us flipping any switches. And so, but the people that were living in the buildings in the center of the apartment community could not control their AC or their heat on their own. They could only control how much the fan blew in their individual apartment based on what we had activated through our central boiler system. And that, as you could imagine, brought up a lot of questions, conflicts, and issues if it was not properly explained to the tenant and they didn't sign that particular addendum. So every single tenant signed that addendum, and we had to go through that addendum in detail to make sure that the tenants understood how the system operated, which sometimes was easier said than done. And so that's just another example of how not just your city or your state, but maybe your property has something unique about it that you need to have a specific lease addendum for, within the parameters of the law, of course, that details what they are agreeing to and what type of living environment they are agreeing to. that was a very unique situation that out of all the properties I've managed across Texas, I've never encountered that anywhere else. That was a very unique experience. But the circumstance required that an addendum to the lease was in there so that the tenant could acknowledge and agree to the terms and conditions for using heat and AC throughout the year. In general, a well-written and comprehensive lease simplifies the life of a landlord. The one thing that it does is it simplifies your job, especially because it removes emotion and any other influence from the equation. If it's written in stone, the tenant has signed it and agreed to it, you've explained it, it's been understood, there is no room for argument or for disagreement. It's something they signed and they agreed to. And so it removes a lot of the emotion from any decision making processes. It allows you to simply point to the lease with empathy, of course, in certain situations. But when lease violations take place or difficult questions or requests come up, it's simply a matter of referring to the lease document with the terms and conditions that you've all agreed to and signed. And it will solve a lot of headache and frustration for you down the road if you've covered all of the various angles of your rental. Here are some of the core things that should generally be detailed in a primary lease agreement. Names of all tenants. That includes, again, this is based on the parameters of the law in your area, assuming that you're allowed to list the names of children or minors in the rental property in Texas. You are required to list anybody over the age of 18 and anybody who is an occupant under the age of 18. All names must be listed on the lease. Again, this solves a lot of conflict when people say that, oh, it's just a guest coming over, or, oh, I didn't realize I needed to add a minor to the lease, or whatever. And so if there's a lot of foot traffic in and out of an apartment or a rental unit of some type, it allows you to say, okay, well, there's only 2 people listed on the lease, but there's like 15 people coming in and out of this apartment all the time. Who are all these other people? Occupancy limits, another issue that arises. How many people do you allow in the rental total, and how many people are permitted per room, and so on and so forth. Again, every city and state is going to have different laws around these lease paragraphs and conditions that you may include in your lease. The terms, is it yearly? Is it monthly? Is it month to month? Is it quarterly? Whatever it is it a 10-year lease? And if it is a long-term lease, does it have built-in increases? A lot of commercial leases typically have built-in increases if you do a longer lease term. The rental amount owed, what the due date is, and what the grace period is. Is the grace period 2 days after the due date, or is it 5 days after the due date? Now, it's also important. One of the things that I'm sure you have probably encountered is there's generally a misunderstanding with tenants with the difference between due date and grace period. Some people say, well, rent isn't due until the 5th. Well, no, the rent is actually due on the 1st. The grace period is through the 5th. And so it's important to make sure that people understand the difference between due date and grace period. Repairs, maintenance requests, pest control. What are the things that are provided by the property management company or the landlord versus what are the tenant responsibilities that needs to be included in your lease agreement, so that issues don't arise down the road when the tenant puts in a pest control request, but your lease specifically states that the tenant is responsible for pest control. Property access by the landlord and property management staff. When are you allowed to access the rental? What type of notice is required, if any? And is there any type of notice required to be left should you have entered the property while the tenant was gone from the rental? Illegal nuisance or other unwanted activity, such as we just discussed, high foot traffic could be one of those things. Bothering the comfort of other tenants in the community, that is another issue that could arise if it is people who are constantly having conflict and arguments that spill out into the community or a nearby rental at 2 a.m. in the morning, and it's causing discomfort and making other tenants and renters feel unsafe, so on and so forth. Those things can be documented in the lease agreement typically. Pets, do you allow aggressive breeds? Do you have weight limits? Is it up to 50 pounds or over, and so on? Commercial use, are they allowed to run a home-based business out of your rental property? In the TAA lease agreement, there are specific conditions of what you can and cannot do out of a rental property in the state of Texas, unless you have an additional addendum that clarifies that those business practices can be expanded to other things outside of the core lease agreement. And so you may want to do that, especially now when there's a lot of remote work happening and people are starting small businesses and so on and so forth. You may want to have some type of clarification regarding what type of business you can run out of my rental property. Move out instructions and charge sheet. It's always helpful to eliminate conflict at the end of a lease when a tenant moves out to make sure that they understand what certain things are going to cost them when they move out. And so one of the things that I would do at a lot of my rental properties was I would include a charge sheet that basically gave a breakdown of the standard costs for things that the tenant may have left in a certain condition. For instance, if the tenant moves out and maybe they hadn't replaced the AC filter in the AC system, and when I go in and do the walkthrough and the AC filter is all dirty and gross, well, I'm going to charge that. And so my charge sheet would have the cost of the AC filter listed on the charge sheet, explaining how much they were going to get billed for that. Likewise, if a light bulb was broken, or if there was a light fixture that was broken, or if a table, furniture, anything I might have included in the rental was damaged or broken, anything that I could put some type of a standard charge to, I would include those things on the charge sheet. You won't be able to put every single detail on the charge sheet, but you can put a lot of the standard things like the AC filter, or if the stopper for the tub is gone that you included in the rental, or for the kitchen, or whatever it might be. Any of those standard things. If the microwave is all dirty and they didn't clean properly, you could have a standard charging fee that you're going to hire a cleaner to come in and clean it. And because they didn't clean it, and they're going to get charged $150 or $200 for that standard charge. You can put that stuff on the charge sheet. And when you include that in the initial lease, and then when you send that to the tenant after they've given you their move out notice, their termination of lease notice, it's always a good practice to send that document again as part of a move out packet or move out instructions, documenting for the tenant, hey, just a reminder, this is the addendum that you signed when you moved in. These are all the charges that you may incur when you move out. If these things aren't taken care of, please take a second to read through this and make sure that your move out experience is smooth and everything works out great. And so moving on, I think we've kind of hammered that one away here. In addition to the primary lease document, you will also likely need to add on a series of addendums that complement or perhaps even expand on some of the sections in the primary lease document. Keep in mind that some of these addendums may or may not be permitted or may not be required in your area. However, I will say that as long as they are permitted in your area, even if they're not necessarily required, some lease addendums may be worthwhile looking into adding to your lease just to give you that added protection or to help mitigate any risks or disagreements down the road. So again, as long as it's permitted in your city or state, but it's not required, you may still want to use some of these common lease addendums. One of those is a signed move-in condition form. A move-in condition form, if you're going to charge a tenant when they move out for things, you have to first set a basis or a foundation for the condition of the rental when they moved in. So for instance, if the tenant moves in with the move-in condition form, and that move-in condition form says that, hey, the one of the blades on the fan is chipped in the master bedroom. Well, the tenant might not care to have the fan replaced entirely, but they do want to document that so that when they move out, they're not charged for having chipped that ceiling fan blade. And so you wouldn't know that, and they wouldn't know that if they haven't documented it and signed it on a move-in condition form. So the way that typically works is a tenant moves in and you give them 24, 48 hours or whatever it is in your area to document the condition of the rental when they moved in and took possession of the rental unit. They sign it and they return it, and you both get a copy of it with your signature and date on it as well. That way, when you do go to move out the tenant and you do send them a charge sheet and you do send them a final bill for damages in the rental, you have something upon which to base those charges that, hey, I didn't charge you for the chipped blade on the fan in the master bedroom, but I did charge you because you broke one of the light fixtures in the bathroom, and that wasn't documented on your moving condition form. So that's just a simple example, but that's how the move-in condition works, and that's how it protects both parties, you and the tenant. And then a signed out move-out condition form. It's important to walk the rental property and document the condition the same day that the tenant turns in their keys and gives up possession of the property. If something happens between the time that they turn in their keys and the time that you walk in, the tenant may not be held responsible for it. For instance, if the tenant turns in their keys on the 1st of the month, but you don't walk it until the 5th, but then somebody broke into that vacant rental on the 3rd between the time that the tenant gave you the keys and relinquished possession of the rental property, they're not going to be able to be held liable or responsible for the condition of the rental because somebody broke in and damaged the unit in the absence of anybody living there or walking it. And so it is very important that you walk the unit the same day that the tenant gives you keys and relinquishes control and possession of the rental property. In addition, it's helpful to have the tenant sign the move out condition form so that all parties involved have agreed to the condition in which the rental was left. It's not the end of the world if the tenant refuses to sign it. Let's say you go walk the rental with the tenant the day that they bring in keys to the office. You go walk the rental unit with them, you document, hey, these things, and these things. And maybe there's a dispute right there and they don't want to sign it. That's fine. That's not the end of the world, but it is helpful to have the tenant sign the move out condition form so that everybody's on the same page that day, so that there's no surprises when they get that final bill in the mail from you for that rental property. A few other lease addendums to consider. In addition, this is quite a list, I know, but in addition to the move in and move out addendums, there are other addendums that come into play at various properties across the US. There are appliances. If appliances are included with the rental, believe it or not, this is a major problem. Some tenants leave with appliances in the from the rental. And so it's important that this is documented, that the tenant agrees that the appliances that are here stay here. That includes the microwave, that includes the ice making machine inside the fridge, that includes the fridge itself, and so on and so forth. Utilities addendum, we already covered that one. If there's a unique situation or it's just something that you want to make sure is expanded upon from the core lease, maybe you have eviction processes if they do not keep utilities on. Let's say the tenant is responsible for utilities through the course of the lease. And if they do not keep the utilities on, that is grounds for eviction. It's a lease violation because what happens when electricity goes off in a rental property? Damages can potentially start to happen. The fridge can start getting messed up. The apartment is not cooled and heated, so it gives opportunity for things like mildew and mold to grow. And so you want to make sure that your rental is protected in that aspect. Subletting. Are your tenants allowed to sublet, especially in an age of companies like Airbnb and Vrbo and so on? Do you let your tenants sublet the rental property out? Are they allowed to use it as a short-term rental? Yes or no? A lot of those are relatively new problems, generally speaking, over the past decade. And so it's important that those are typically addressed in your lease, especially if you are in a part of town where that is a common thing that's happening. If it is, I guarantee it is happening because you can make a fortune subletting out your rental, especially on short-term leases in some pretty high demand areas. No smoking. If there's smoke damages, what happens? If they do smoke, what happens? What's the process? Maintenance addendum. How are maintenance requests handled? What's the time frame in which they can expect them to be handled? What format do you accept maintenance requests to be submitted to your rental management company, and so on and so forth? Extended absence by the tenant. If the tenant leaves the rental property for any given amount of time, what is the limit? What should they expect to happen in the event that they are absent of the property? What happens if they take their stuff out of the property and it's just left vacant and they haven't paid rent? Things of that nature. What's the process? Lease termination provision for military personnel. In Texas, there are quite a few military bases, and so this is something I encountered quite a bit. So it's important that you have a lease termination provision for military personnel. This is required under law, at least in Texas, that you have clauses that allow military personnel to get out of the lease based on certain circumstances on their end with their military obligations and the status of their deployment. Tenant assumes responsibility for maintenance if the tenant is responsible, and so on and so forth. I could go over these all day, but it's important to go through these different addendums and look at if you have these types of things covered in your lease. And if not, you may want to make sure that you have these things added, again, under the parameters of what's permitted in your area under the law. Beyond these rental agreement forms, there's a host of other legal documents that are important for managing rentals as well. It's not just lease addendums for tenants, it could be third-party owner management agreements. It could be service provider agreements or other rental documents. For instance, if you're managing properties for third-party owners, it's important to have a very well-built and comprehensive owner management agreement so that there's no disagreements and no misunderstandings down the road about who's responsible for what and how things get handled. And for instance, is there a limit? Are you allowed to authorize a repair or a maintenance cost over a certain amount of dollars? So some owners were okay with you authorizing repairs and maintenance and things of that nature up to $1,000, or maybe they only wanted me to authorize it up to 500. And if it was over 500, I needed to reach out to them to get authorization for it. And so those things need to be documented in third-party owner management agreements. Service provider agreements. Maybe you have a contract with a local provider and you want to document how they get paid, when they get paid, how frequently they get paid, what are the conditions for them getting paid. All kinds of different agreements that you need to consider when managing a rental property. And so it's not just tenant lease addendums, it's all kinds of lease documents and addendums. And it will make your life so much simpler when everything, as much as possible, is in writing. And again, it removes a lot of the emotion and future conflict down the road when these things are properly addressed in writing and agreed to with a signature from both parties involved. At the end of the day, the list of rental documents that every landlord should have is typically guided by the idea that it's better to be over-prepared than under-prepared. I would read that again, but hopefully that is hopefully that's as clear as it can get. I cannot overstress how many times in property management over the years I was very grateful for the documents that people had signed that we had put as a part of our lease agreements, because there are so many random things that can take place in property management when you are dealing with people and you are dealing with real estate and all of the things that can come into play. And you have no idea what might come down the road even tomorrow. And so having these very well prepared, over prepared documents that seem like they might be excessive are really going to come in clutch in the moment when those things do present themselves. And trust me, they will. Problems rarely arise when we're prepared and expecting them, but thankfully, a thorough and well designed lease agreement will be ready to back you up regardless of what gets thrown your way. It's better to have a watertight lease than to find out that there are holes all over and loopholes or outright omissions in your lease that allow for nightmare scenarios to play out. And I have seen nightmare scenarios play out. They're not fun. These situations can end up costing you significant sums of money and or frustrations down the road. And that pretty much wraps up this presentation. Again, I realize that some of the information shared here may be a little bit basic and 101 property management type content, but hopefully you have gained some insight and some information from the presentation that really helps you think about ways that you can continue to mitigate any potential risk down the road, and especially conflict and things that just consume your time. The TenantCloud software is built around saving you time essentially and automating as much as possible. And so one of those ways that you can continue to do that even above and beyond the software is by making sure that your documents cover you from as many different angles as possible. Again, if you want to access any of the core forms that can be used across all 50 states, you just go to the settings gear wheel icon in the upper right corner of your TenantCloud account and then click the document templates button in the settings menu. And from there, you can click on the Landlord Forms tab. And then from there, you can start to go through those core documents to make sure that you have each of those things, even if you don't use the ones that are provided through the TenantCloud system, at least making sure that those are a part of your lease that you are using inside of TenantCloud or not. There will be a recording. I'm going to answer a couple of the questions that have come through here. Did this guy tell us his name? I might have missed it. I apologize if I did not. My name is Chris, and I work on the TenantCloud team. I've been with the TenantCloud software for, I think it's something like 5 years now, and I've been in property management in general for over a decade. There are pet addendums that I don't think that there is a pet addendum in the TenantCloud Landlord Forms. Let me just double check. Oh, I lied. Pet addendum to rental agreement. Yes, there is a pet addendum that can be used across all 50 states that you can review and make sure that it covers whatever information you need it to cover for whatever troubles you're encountering with ESAs. That's actually a great point. ESA issues have become a really big deal across the US. It doesn't take long to figure that out when you are part of any property management or landlord group on Facebook or Reddit or wherever. ESAs are a big problem. So that's actually a great question. I'd recommend checking out the pet addendum agreement that is on the Landlord Forms tab and see if that covers what you need it for. Otherwise, there are a lot of great resources out there nowadays because it's really, that issue has really become prominent. And so there's a ton of resources out there how to mitigate and control that issue at your particular property, especially if you're encountering something consistently at your rentals. So TenantCloud prepackages documents that we can all buy from TC. Great idea for those who don't know how to create their own. We get the benefits, get to the price per doc. So the doc is included on the growth plan. So there's no additional cost for each of those documents as long as you're on the growth plan. And so that it's not a per document fee on those. You can just get those set up on the growth plan. Next question here. Looks like you have to have at least the growth. I don't have that. Yeah, correct. You do need to be on the growth plan to access the core documents. The reason for that is the growth plan is really what is designed to be more for property managers, people who manage third-party properties for other owners, or if you have multiple legal entities, like let's say maybe you own 10 different LLCs, but each one of those LLCs is technically a different legal entity. And so the growth plan allows you to more effectively manage those legal entities, even if you're the owner of all of them, and allows the system to do the taxes and process transactions and things better and more efficiently for you. And it keeps track of it. So at the end of the year or at the end of each quarter, you have a better accounting of what's taken place with your various legal entities and where money came from, where it went, and so on and so forth. So even if you manage your own rentals, but they're each a different LLC, I would highly recommend looking at getting on the growth plan anyway. It just makes your life a lot easier having access to those tools. Will there be a recording for us to view at a later time? I missed a few parts of the presentation. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for asking. This is automatically recorded. And so the same link that you use to join this presentation, in about 30 minutes, you're going to be able to use that same link to come back to it and you'll have access to the recording. It just takes the software we're using, airmeet.com. It takes them about 20 or 30 minutes to get that video generated and uploaded. And then you'll be able to access it. If you have any issues with that, please feel free to reach out to sales@tenantcloud.com, and our team will be happy to send you a direct link if you have any issues accessing the recording. Good job. Can we get a recording slides of this presentation to rewatch? Yes. Yep. The same link. You'll be able to come back and access it. I missed almost the whole presentation. Can I find it somewhere in TenantCloud? Yes. You'll be able to use this same link. And also, in case you weren't aware, if you go to tenantcloud.com and click on the resources tab, there's actually a button there that you can click in that submenu that gives you access to podcasts, webinars, articles, and all of this type of media content. And so you can listen to TenantCloud podcasts, you can watch these webinars, you can access the direct links, and so on and so forth. Last question here. Looks like we have a question about any mold addendums. So I'm checking underneath this thing here. Lead-based. There is a lead-based paint disclosure, but I do not see a agreement. We do have them in Texas as a part of the TAA lease. A mold addendum. The one that is in TenantCloud, though, that is applicable for all 50 states is a lead-based paint disclosure. So I believe that means that the mold addendum probably changes from state to state. So you'd probably want to source that from outside of the TenantCloud software. You can check which plan you are on by going to the settings gear wheel icon in the upper right corner of your TenantCloud account, and then click the sub-menu button that says subscription. It's the second one from the top, and it'll tell you which subscription plan you are a part of. And if you need to upgrade from there to the growth plan, you can click on the button that says upgrade plan or upgrade, and that will take you to the options of the various plans and help you get the right one for your business. If you have any questions about that, again, feel free to reach out to sales@tenantcloud.com. If you have questions about the different plans, we're happy to walk through that with you and get a plan that works best for the needs for your company and what you need to accomplish right now. The guidance on ESAs is right there. Yes, HUD.gov. That is a fantastic resource page to go to if you have questions about ESAs. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that, Timothy. That is awesome. I think that is pretty much everything. If you have any additional questions or you missed anything or you have any issues accessing the the recorded version of this, please feel free again to email sales@tenantcloud.com, and our team is happy to get you connected with whatever information you need about the account, what plan you're on, what plan you should be on, and so on and so forth. Again, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the TenantCloud platform.